Hey everyone, it's Kevin here. Welcome to the second part of the video series where I talk about camera basics. Last time I talked about aperture. You can check that video out right here. And today I'm going to be talking about shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter is open. In the time that the shutter is open, light reaches the camera sensor that lies behind the shutter. And it's a simpler concept than aperture was from last time, and all it requires to understand it is a simple understanding of the innards of a camera. So I have a older model of a Nikon DSLR here, and let's open it up and see what's inside. So let's take the lens off. I remember how to do this. Okay, so you can see here that there's a shutter, and whenever I hit the shutter button, it moves up and leaves the sensor behind it exposed. So as you can see, the camera sensor lies right behind the shutter, and if the shutter is open for a longer period of time, more light will be able to reach the sensor behind it. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, so a 1/4000 shutter speed means that the shutter is only open for just 1/4000th of a second. And that means that the sensor is only exposed for that time. A slower shutter speed would be 1/30, which means that the shutter is open for 1/30th of a second. And that means the sensor is exposed to the subject for 1/30th of a second, which is a bit slower. And finally, shutter speeds can go into numbers of seconds. So 1, 2, or even 30-second shutter speeds are possible with DSLRs. Photographers tend to call these longer shutter speeds long exposures. Some cameras might express shutter speeds in terms of just the bottom part of the fraction. So it might display 30 for 1/30th shutter speed or 4000 for a 1/4000 shutter speed. Because shutter speed impacts the amount of time the sensor is exposed to a scene, the longer the shutter, the brighter your picture is going to be, as you might expect. So if you're shooting outside on a really bright day, you'd want to shoot with a really fast shutter speed, like 1/4000 or 1/2000, to compensate for the really bright environment. In darker environments, you'd want a slower shutter speed, like 1/60 or 1/30, and this will allow more light to collect onto the sensor and your photo to be brighter as a result. Longer shutter speeds will also add motion blur to your photo. What this means is that the longer the shutter is open, the more time your subject has to, let's say, just move around the frame. So if it's moving around the frame for the entire duration of the shutter speed, then the sensor is going to capture all of that movement in one photo. So typically if you're shooting a quick moving subject, you'd want a really fast shutter speed to freeze the exact moment in time that your subject is moving. If you're shooting a snowstorm, you might want to freeze the moment in time to capture every single snowflake that's in the frame. Motion blur is also desirable in some cases. So if I wanted to show the movement of the snowflakes in the snowstorm to show that it's really windy or something, I could shoot with a slower shutter speed, and that'll capture the movement of all the snowflakes as they're moving through the air. So if you watched my previous video, we ended on the question, if you're in a dark environment and want a really large depth of field with the entire scene in focus, how would you accomplish that? Well, now we know that we can accomplish this with a really slow shutter speed. If you want your entire scene to be in focus in a dark environment, having a really slow shutter speed will allow you to shoot at a really small aperture or a large f-stop. So in this case, you'd want to shoot at f/18 or f/22 and maybe have a shutter speed that's a couple seconds long. And this will allow you to have a well-lit photo in a dark environment that also has a really large depth of field so that the entire scene is in focus. However, we're still missing one piece to the puzzle here. If you have the same exact situation as I described just now, but you're shooting a moving subject in this instance in the dark environment, the slow shutter speed will cause the subject to be blurry. Well, this brings us to the third and final part of this photography tutorial series, which is ISO. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for that one. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, I'd really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. And that's a wrap.